We're continuing our journey through the Gospel of John, and we've come up on this hot summer day to a passage that's continuing the story of the trial of Jesus. And I want to tell you that I hope for you, as it has been for me, that looking at this story out of season, if you will be as much a blessing to you as it has been to me. I know that as a pastor, and probably for many of you as well, we subconsciously tend to relegate the story around the arrest and trial and crucifixion of Jesus to a little period of time that we call Holy Week. And for me to take that story out of Holy Week and move it into the summer has opened up its meaning and its richness for me. We know intellectually that Jesus' death is relevant all year round. But this is probably the first time in my career that I focused on it in this depth in the summertime. And it's a reminder to me, and I hope a reminder to you, of the relevance of Jesus all year round, especially this part of his life. Now, we're going to be going through this story as we did the first part of his trial a few weeks ago. Those of you who are here will recall that we looked at the first part of Jesus' trial when he was brought before Caiaphas. We're continuing that story today. We're not going as far as the scripture indicates, because I realized in the bridge today I got a little bit too ambitious, as pastors are wont to get. And I've decided to split it up into 2 weeks, which you'll be glad to hear because it's a little bit warm out today. So we're going to focus on just the first part of this trial. And as we do, I want you to keep in mind that there are 3 main characters in this story. The first one, of course, is Jesus. And I want you to notice throughout this story about Jesus his utter majesty and the control that he has. Normally, when a person is brought before trial, brought before a judge, they feel out of control. You know, things are being done to them. Other people are speaking. Accusations are being leveled. Interrogations are being held. And the person who's being tried is out of control. This was not the case with Jesus. Throughout this whole story, Jesus is like a conductor. And he's orchestrating all the events. At times, he's like a prosecuting attorney, and he's the one doing the interrogating. Jesus was not caught off guard by these events. He was not taken by surprise. He was not out of control. He orchestrated everything that took place. So he's the first character. The second character, of course, are the Jewish religious leaders who are bringing the charges against him. And as you look at them, I want you to see the degree to which they are out of control. They've become like a rabid mob, and all they can see is that they want Jesus dead. And whatever they have to do, whatever they have to say to accomplish that, they're willing to do. They'll sell out their morals, their ethics, everything they believe in to see Jesus die. They're completely out of control. And then, of course, the third character is the Roman governor, Pilate himself. Now, to understand Pilate, we have to understand a little bit about his history and the Jewish political situation at the time. Many of you know that at the time of Jesus' arrest and trial and crucifixion, Jerusalem, Israel, was an occupied nation. They were occupied by the Romans. And so they no longer had political autonomy. Every decision they made that was of significance had to be supported by the Romans. And in order to maintain control over this area of his empire, the Roman emperor appointed governors to manage his interests, keep the people from rebelling, and to preside over the political climate of the day. And at this point, the Roman governor was a man named Pilate. Now, Pilate and the Jews had an interesting relationship. Pilate hated the Jews, and the Jews hated Pilate. Now, Pilate was not accountable to the Jews. He could do what he wanted without consulting them, but the Jews had the recourse that they could complain against him to the emperor, and if the emperor heard enough complaints, he might recall Pilate to Rome and appoint another governor. And Pilate would lose a lucrative and powerful position, and he was aware of that. And so there was a dance between the Jewish leaders and Pilate, where at times they were antagonizing one another, and at times they tried to support one another. And at this point in his career, Pilate had not gotten off to too good a start. He had done two things that had almost caused rebellions. The first one was right after he became the Roman governor. Right after he was appointed, he was making his first state visit to Jerusalem. And he brought with him all kinds of guards and soldiers, and there was a lot of pomp and circumstance. And part of the ceremony was the Roman guards marching into Jerusalem with a pole, and on top of the pole was an eagle. And the eagle symbolized the Roman emperor, who was regarded as divine. Of course, the Jewish people considered that eagle to be an idol. And here was a pagan bringing an idol into Jerusalem, the heart of Israel. You can imagine how that went over. It almost resulted in a rebellion. And Pilate had to do some quick thinking. He withdrew the standard from Jerusalem and came into the city without it. But he was angry. His pride had been pricked. The Jews had won, and he was angry. And then a short time after that, he decided that Jerusalem needed a new water supply. And so he wanted to build an aqueduct that would bring fresh water into Jerusalem. And he was right. Jerusalem was always short of water, and this new aqueduct would be a much needed public service to the people. But the mistake that he made was that he decided to pay for it with money out of the Jewish temple. Well, this was money that was devoted to God. So you can imagine how that went over, but this time Pilate won, the money was taken, and the aqueduct was built. And so there was a tension, a near open hostility between the Jewish people and Pilate. Pilate was arrogant against the Jews. He looked down on them, and the Jews were constantly complaining about him to the Roman emperor. And that is the context of the scene that we encounter today. It's Romans chapter 18, beginning at verse 28. We're going to go through this in very minute detail. And you can look up the scripture up at the screen. You can use the Bibles in the pew in front of you. If you have your iPhone, your Samsung, your iPad with you, use that. but it gives you an opportunity to see exactly what's unfolding in this scene. Romans chapter 18, beginning at verse 28. I said Romans. John, thank you. See, make sure you're not sleeping with it being warm here. John chapter 18, beginning at verse 28. Remember that Jesus has been just finished being tried by Caiaphas, the father of the high priest. They wanted him put to death, but they didn't have the authority to put him to death because only Rome could issue the death penalty. So they had to bring him before Pilate in order to get him put to death. Verse 28, then the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. That's Pilate. By now, it was early morning, so Jesus has been up all night, being questioned, being interrogated, being tortured. And to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not want to enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. Keep in mind that Jesus had just finished celebrating the Passover with his disciples. That's Maundy Thursday that we normally celebrate earlier in the year. And in order to celebrate the Passover, the Jews had to keep themselves ceremonially unclean. Had they entered into the palace of Pilate, they would have been rendered unclean. And so they remained outside, and Pilate had to go out to them. Think about that for a moment. Here's a group of people who are willing to sell themselves out completely, break every common moral, ethical, legal boundary in order to see this innocent man die. But at the same time, they're not wanting to render themselves unclean, so they're following the very minutiae of the law. And I wonder if there are Christians like that today, who follow all the observances, all the customs, all the little things that Christians are supposed to do, but when it comes to love and justice and mercy, they fail. It's very possible for the spirit of the Pharisees to get into churches today. And we need to make sure that we're not following the little commands and missing out on the central command of love. And so they have to avoid ceremonial uncleanness. The Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" And they respond in verse 30, "If he were not a criminal," the literal Greek means doing wrong, "we would not have handed him over to you." So they want Pilate to pronounce the death penalty on Jesus because Jesus did wrong. Can you imagine how rich that is? Can you imagine bringing someone to the RCMP today and saying to the RCMP, "We want you to arrest this man." Well, what did he do? Well, he did wrong. But what did he do? Well, if he hadn't done wrong, we wouldn't have brought him to you. That's what the Jews are saying. He's a criminal. He's done wrong. It's obvious because we're bringing him to you. And if we're bringing him to you, he's done wrong. You see the blindness that these religious leaders had. And so Pilate responds to them out of just disgust for what they're doing. He says, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." In one sense, it's out of disgust. In another sense, he doesn't want to deal with them. And my friends, again, it's possible for us to be like Pilate. We want other people to make a decision about Jesus. We want other people to decide who he is. We don't want to have to make that decision ourselves. We don't want to be confronted with his demands. We don't want to be confronted with having to make a verdict on our own behalf of who this man is. And so we shove him off to another person, another time, another place. But this is something that all of us have to face. And all of us have to deal with. Who is Jesus? I'm going to come back to that. But Pilate says to them, take him yourselves, judge him by your own law. And then Pilate realizes how serious the Jews are taking this. They say to him, but we have no right to execute anyone. And then we're told in verse 32, and this is one of the key verses, this happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. And what is it Jesus had said? He had said, if I be lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Jesus had prophesied that he was going to be lifted up. And as he was lifted up, he said he would draw all people, all men and women to him. And we see again the utter control Jesus had. He conducted these events. He directed them. Everything worked out according to God's plan. Nothing was caught Jesus off guard. Nothing took him by surprise. This happened so that the words Jesus had spoken, indicating the kind of death he was going to die, would be fulfilled. Then we're told in verse 33, Pilate then went back inside the palace. Remember, the Jews wouldn't go in because they didn't want to render themselves unclean. So Pilate had gone outside. He then goes back into the palace, and he wants to interrogate Jesus because he's realizing now the Jews want him dead. And so he says to Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? And Jesus responds to this with a question of his own. Pilate thought he was going to interrogate Jesus. Jesus decides to interrogate Pilate, and he says to them, is this your own idea, or did others talk to you about me? And Jesus is confronting Pilate with the same question that all of us are confronted with. Who is Jesus? Is he the king of the Jews? Is he who he claims to be? Is this your own idea, Jesus says? Or did someone put it into your head? Now, from a practical perspective, we understand why Jesus is asking this as well. If Pilate is asking this on his own authority, he wants to know if Jesus is a threat to the empire. If Jesus is declaring himself king, then he's a threat to the empire and he should be put to death. But if the Jews are telling him that he's the king of the Jews, then it's simply a religious designation and it's not something for Rome to deal with. And so from a practical perspective, in order to understand what Pilate says, Jesus asks him, is this your own idea? Or did others talk to you about me? But Jesus is also confronting Pilate with that question, who am I? Who do you say that I am? And Pilate, again, we see his arrogance coming out. Am I a Jew? Pilate replied, it was your people, so here's the truth that comes out. It was your people and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done? Now, a little bit further down, we'll see this next week. When the Jews are trying to get Pilate to pronounce the death penalty on Jesus, They say to Pilate, "We have no king but Caesar." They're saying Jesus isn't our king because Caesar is. And it's absolutely remarkable that the Jews would say that these religious leaders would say that, because all through the Old Testament, the common message from the judges and from the prophets was that you have no king but God. God is your king. God is your king. God is your king. You have no king but God. But in order to get Jesus killed, they sell out on one of the most basic and profound premises of their faith, and they're willing to say, "We have no king but Caesar." They're like a pack of rabid animals who have sold themselves out in order to see the death of this man. It was your own people, Pilate says, and your chief priests who handed you over to me. What is it you have done? And so Jesus responds, and he probably put Pilate's mind at ease, and he says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews." Now there's two things there we need to notice. First one is, Jesus says, if my kingdom were of this world, my followers would fight to keep me from being arrested by the Jews. Pilate is asking him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus is saying, "It's the Jews who had me arrested." Does that sound like the type of king that you're thinking of? How can I be their king when they're arresting me, when they're trying to kill me? But the other thing Jesus says is, my kingdom, literal Greek is my reign, R-E-I-G-N. My reign is not of this world. Now that probably put Pilate's mind at ease, because at this point, scholars say, he probably had no more than a few hundred soldiers in Jerusalem. Jesus, aside from what's happening, was a very popular person. If Jesus had wanted to take over Jerusalem at this point, he probably could have. He probably could have rallied enough men to either kill the soldiers or drive them out of Jerusalem. Pilate knew this. And so he was probably relieved to hear Jesus say, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jews, but now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," says Pilate. And Jesus answers, and this is key, "You are right in saying that I am a king. In fact, for this reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And Pilate responds, "What is truth?" And in the bridge this morning, we had, as you saw earlier in this service, a large group of young people getting ready to go off to Louisiana. And I challenged them, as they prepare for a mission tour, to get that question straight in their minds. To understand that the message that they are taking with them, it's not only an unpopular message in the United States, it's just as unpopular a message in Canada today. And that's why it's so hard for young people to be believers today. Because our culture tells us over and over and over again, there is no such thing as truth. You hear this from kids in schools today. They don't believe in truth, certainly in absolute truth. Now, you can have your truth, and if it works for you, that's fine. God bless you. But don't you dare tell me that your truth is my truth, or even worse, that your truth is true for all people in all times and all places. And certainly don't say that truth is embodied in an individual, in a human being who lived 2,000 years ago, because that's viewed as narrow, as intolerant, as bigoted, as judgmental. And yet, as believers today, as unpopular as that message is, we stake our faith and our lives and our eternity on Jesus' claim that I am the way, the truth, and the life. The message that we proclaim we cannot compromise on. That Jesus is the truth. That he is absolute truth. And it's not just my truth. It's not just your truth. It's true for all people in all times, in all places. And this is so central that Jesus tells Pilate, this is the reason I was born, and for this reason I came into the world to testify to the truth. He's saying his whole reason he came into the world was to let us know that there is truth, and not only that there is truth, but that Jesus is the truth. You see, every other religious leader who ever lived, at best they came to show the way to the truth. Jesus is the only one who is the way. He is the truth. He is the life. And I challenge the young people going off to Louisiana, not only in Louisiana, but here, not to compromise on that message. There's a term that sociologists use today to describe young people. And the term is laughing in the dark. And sociologists tell us that and not just sociologists, but I see it in my own ministry, young people are searching today. They don't have any direction, any purpose, any meaning. They don't know what their lives mean or where they're going. They're in the dark. And so many times, if they don't despair, they say, you know what? We're in the dark. We might as well have a good time. We might as well enjoy ourselves. We might as well laugh. And sociologists call that laughing in the dark. They're in the dark, but they're trying to have a good time. And it's the young people today, and all of us today, who have to have the courage to say that there is truth, and that Jesus of Nazareth is the truth. We might get the same response that Jesus got, where Pilate says to him, what is truth? What is truth? And then Pilate didn't wait for a response, but he went out again to the Jews, and he says to them, I find no basis for a charge against them. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the King of the Jews? They shouted back, no, not him. Give us Barabbas. And now we're told at the very end of this chapter, and this is as far as we're going to go, Barabbas had taken part in a rebellion. Now the common view is that Barabbas was a thief. He wasn't a thief. He was a revolutionary. Remember that Jerusalem was a hot spot. Every once in a while there would be an attempted rebellion that the Romans would have to come in and quash. Barabbas had been a part of one of those rebellions. And he had been captured and he'd been sentenced to death. And so we have this surreal scene where Jesus of Nazareth, who was innocent, was being accused of seeking to overthrow the Roman government. And on the other side, an actual revolutionary who had sought to overthrow the Roman government was being set free. The innocent man is put to death. The guilty man is set free. When I was preparing for this message, I came across a fictional account of the story of Barabbas. And it's an interesting picture. It's a fictional account, but it shows Barabbas after he's been released. And he comes to the foot of Calvary, the hill on which Jesus was crucified. And he sees Jesus at the top of the hill, off in the distance. He's hanging from this cross, and a shiver goes down Barabbas' spine, and he thinks to himself, that should have been me. He took my place. He died for me. And the insight that Barabbas has there is an insight that God wants all of us to gain. That when we're looking up at Calvary and we see Jesus hanging on the cross, to recognize that should have been me. He took my place. He died for me. That's why Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. He's up there for you and for me. He died for us. He took our place.